Hello and welcome to our live development stream for April 2020. And without further ado, let me just press play here and make sure the audio is on. And first of all, a big shout out to Steve Björk for the audio track. So I see Steve's in the chat. Well, thanks for sending this to me earlier today. And what you have just seen is the result of experimenting with audio files and extracting frequencies from audio files this week, which is the basic research for the audio frequency node, which is the plugin of the month for April as well as for next month, because this is a 2-month project. And I suppose the fact that I've been working on this part for most of this week already shows you why it's a 2-month project, because we do require the research time just to get everything, all the basics, the way they're supposed to be. So what you're basically seeing here is the normal audio track that's been loaded into Lightwave itself. And as I'm scrubbing through, the user interface, which is just like a work in progress user interface, automatically updates the spectrum up there and the audio waveform. And the audio file is loaded separately into the analyzer. I've turned off the audio, so you can't actually. I haven't turned it off yet. No, I have. And that just gives you an idea of what's happening at the current frame. What the node will essentially allow you to do is on the top here, you have the frequencies from like 32 hertz to up to 22 kilohertz in this case. And you have the distribution of volumes across the frequency band for a certain frame. With the node, you'll be able to use any of these bands or a selection of these and use that in turn to drive animation values or to drive any values. So you'll be able to like select this bar and use that as a scalar value in your node graph, which could be a node graph that you're using to animate something, but it could also be one that you're using to displace a mesh, or even one that you're using to color your surfaces. So the way I designed this is, let me just load a different audio file. Let's take, I think this one is fairly good. No, I shall use, I'll use that one. All right. So again, this is just all of my testing code here. and I'm currently loading. I can load WAV files, waveforms, and MP3s. I'm also going to be able to load FLAC compressed audio files. I'm not sure about Apple Audio, mainly because I haven't found a library to load those with decent licensing conditions. So this tells me it's got 2 channels. Sample rate is 44.1 kilohertz. It has a total of 3.79 million samples, a length of 1 minute 27 seconds, or just 86 seconds, and a memory size of 14 megabytes. Again, this is just for me, so I know that my code is working the way it should. Now, what happens is after this is being loaded, the whole audio file is going to be analyzed, spread up into the different audio spectrums, and those are also going to be cached in memory. So this is what's happening now, and that took less than a second or something. There is actually a progress bar, but the progress bar isn't visible if it's too short. And this again gives me a number of points here, like the amount of frequency entries, which is the amount of frames, and the maximum and the minimum of the values that I've computed. Again, this is just by the debugging code, really. Some of that information will, however, be visible eventually. And then you get something like this. It's actually the same spectrum, it's the same audio file. I should pick up a different one. And what I did today, just clear this, to actually make sure that I've been doing the right thing, is I got some like standard sine wave audio files. Like this one is 440 hertz and nothing else. It's just sine wave. Lasts 30 seconds. And I'm also not going to play it because it's just a beep. But if I scrub through it, you will notice that it, gives me a peak at 44 hertz, and this is residue from the way the audio frequencies are computed. What is interesting here is vertically, and there's no label on that graph yet. Up here we have 0 decibels, and down here we currently have minus 96 decibels. And you can see that you will get some residue in certain areas. Later on, if you actually want to use this to animate, you will not only be able to select the frequency, but also the decibel range, which is like the vertical range, where your scalar value, that is the output of the node, is going to be 0 and where it's going to be 1. So that way you'll be able to pinpoint exactly which part of the frequencies you want and which volume of the frequencies you want to animate. So yeah, this is 440 hertz, and that's working as it should. Let's try another sine wave. Let's make it 100 hertz, which is a lot lower. It's more in the bass. There we go. Bam, 100 hertz. That's where it is. And let's try something like 10 kilohertz. No, it's 1 kilohertz, I think. There we go. And that's where you get the peak. Yes, I have. I downloaded these test files yesterday and just verified lots of stuff today. If you've been following us on Discord, you probably read most of that. This is 10 kilohertz. And I used this to verify it, and I found out that I had an offset that grew with all the stereo files that I tested till I found out like an hour before we started the live stream that I was actually not taking the fact that I've got 2 samples and not 1 for stereo files into account. So my offsets were wrong when computing the frequencies. Got that fixed. So yeah, currently the state is that essentially all of the frequency extraction seems to work as it should. But that's just the state as of 1 hour ago. And yeah, this is another one that Steve sent me. Isolate, which is a bit more complex, and I forgot how many frames this was, but yeah, should be enough. So basically, this is completely independent of the audio in Lightwave itself. The idea is that this selector is going to be more like a pop-up, like for images. Yes, we were talking about liters, not cups of coffee that were needed. um, but yeah, I mean, you basically the whole frequency extraction is to a large part third-party open source code, and getting that to work wasn't really the problem. But then making sure that all the inputs and outputs are what they should be was a bit trickier. I was going to say yes. The basic idea is going to be that you will be able to have multiple audio files loaded into a scene. All of these, as you load them in, will pre-compute all the frequencies. Those will be stored in RAM. And that allows all the plugins that use those audio files to retrieve the values as quickly as possible, as opposed to having to recompute them every time, which doesn't seem to take long as you're loading in the audio file. But if you, for example, use it for shading, then that would take quite a long time, because you would recompute parts of the frequency spectrum for every shaded spot on a surface, and you want that to be as quick as possible. So plenty of caching. On the other hand, it's not going to use that much memory. It's like, I don't know, for like a 3 or 4 minute piece, it's like 50 megabytes or so for the audio file itself, because I want to keep that in so you can actually see the waveform, and maybe another 20 or 30 megabytes for the actual spectrum. It doesn't get transferred to the timeline at all to Lightwave 10, not yet. You will eventually have a button where you can basically load the audio file that you're working on into Lightwave. Right now you have to do that, classical way via the scene editor. Let me just check which one it is. It's isolate. So if I load the audio here, that's isolate. And yeah, all of this you'll be able to do that via one button. There is a command for that. What I can't do is actually change the offset within Lightwave, not from the plugin itself. You can change it here. If you go to audio, you can have the audio start time. You can change that. I can't retrieve that, and I also can't set it. But yes, there will be a button for that. And yeah, now I've got this loaded into Lightwave, and I'm not sure if any of you are that familiar with the audio tools in Lightwave, but what's nice is that the audio waveform also shows up behind the graph editor. And let me just turn on the volume again for the desktop and play this. Again, another tune by Steve, who is in the chat. So again, thanks a lot. And you can see that it's picking up the bass nicely. Yeah, it's essentially working as it should. All right, I'll just stop it right here. So the idea is going to be that you have multiple audio files loaded into your scene. They all have their pre-computed frequency distribution. And then you will be able to use a channel modifier or a node to extract any part of that. So you can either just say, I want this frequency, or you will be able to use a window that's very similar to the top part here to visually select a rectangle. Just, drag it, open it, and say, I want this section to be relevant for this node. And it's going to extract a scalar value from that, which you can then in turn use to drive whatever you want to, like the position of an item, displacements, shading, whatever. The node is also going to have both a time and a time offset input, and will also have a frequency input. So one thing you can do is, for example, if you imagine a grid and you use the x coordinate on that grid as the frequency, and the z coordinate that goes into the depth of the scene as a time offset, then you can visualize this whole frequency thing as a displacement on the plane, but it's also going to wander backwards as time goes on and as the music plays. John, were you thinking of showing existing triggers on that display as well, or just for selecting new triggers? Well, the problem is it doesn't really trigger anything. It gives you a direct value. The problem with a trigger in general is the fact that if you in Lightwave itself, you have to be able, or you should be able, to evaluate the state of a node at any random time. Something like a trigger requires you to remember if that trigger has actually been hit before that. So the only way for a node to know that is to basically track back in time to see if that trigger has been hit or not. And the longer the scene and the later within that scene that node is being evaluated, the longer it will have to compute, because it has to search forward to check if that trigger has been hit. For something like an audio frequency, that would be trivial to do, easy to do, because it doesn't involve anything within Lightwave. But if you imagine that you actually want to have a trigger that depends on, let's say, another object hitting a certain position, then it also has to evaluate the position for that other object for all the previous frames to see if it has been triggered or not. Well, the thing is, you will have multiple nodes that will be able to leverage this graph for selection. I don't think that I'm actually going to remember which other nodes are looking at which ranges. However, what I want to do is basically have a window like this that is separate from any specific node or something, and give you the option to either show the spectrum or the waveform and maybe a power spectrum visualization as well. And you have basically a pop-up, and have as many of these open as possible. So, if there's multiple audio files that you've loaded and you want to monitor 2 or 3 of them, or monitor the spectrum of one of them and the waveform of another one, you'll be able to have multiple windows like this one open. No, they will not play back at the same time. The playing back of the audio, that's just what Lightwave does. And what it always did. You can load an audio file into Lightwave. It shows up down here. If you scrub it, you hear it. And Lightwave uses whatever single audio file is loaded there. But you can load multiple audio files to analyze them and use them to drive something. So in that sense, what you can do is you can load your final mix as an audio as something to hear into Lightwave, but to take the separate tracks and load them into the frequency analyzer, and then have different nodes take different parts, the different tracks apart into different frequencies and use those to drive something. Yeah, John. Yeah, I'm not sure if I mean, you would eventually just have multiple rectangles here that tell you, okay, this is being used, this is being used, that's being used. I'll see what I can do. I might have to, redesign the architecture a bit, and it would also mean that I'd have to make sure that if you see the other ranges that are being monitored by something else, that it's only for the specific audio file. I'll have to think about that. But yeah, the idea is going to be that you have this node, and if you actually want to pick a range, it's going to open a window that looks like the top half here. And that's where you can select something. And to be fair, if that works, I'll be happy enough. There will also be options like if you're selecting a range here, to either have the average value or the peak values. And yeah, I think that's about it. One thing I also want to extract is the overall volume, which is not being displayed here. And I might even have like a preset of frequencies like bass, mids, highs, and upper highs, and maybe even add a super simple node that just exposes those four, which are going to be at fixed frequencies, so you can just do something quick and dirty without having to analyze the audio yourself. Like the easy node. But the more elaborate one will allow you to tweak which range of the frequencies you want to extract for that specific node or for that specific channel modifier. Yeah, everything that you see here is being rendered in on the CPU. I could also render that on the GPU. However, that would mean writing GLSL shaders, and yeah, getting those to work on the Mac is a bit iffy, especially because on one side our Mac is a bit old, and the OpenGL support isn't that good, and on the other hand, I can only write GL shading code up to a certain feature set, because that's when macOS separates applications into ones that use old OpenGL and new OpenGL, and you can't mix them like you can on Windows. So I'll probably leave this as being software rendered. Yeah, I learned that lesson with GLSL, writing the image viewer for Xartrator, the recent one, because that actually does a lot of processing on the GPU, at least on Windows, and should on Mac as well, depending on the OpenGL version. Also, one thing that's going to be added currently, if it's a stereo file like this one, I'm only processing the left track, but that was because until like 1.5 hours ago, it didn't work the way it was supposed to anyways. There's going to be support if like the track or audio file is stereo, you'll be able to get the left channel, right channel, or the merged channel, which will mean that there'll be a bit more caching, but that's just about it. And also, one point that I need to make is that currently, basically the frequencies here are cached for every single frame that cover the duration of the audio file. So let's say if an audio file is, let's make it easy, 10 seconds long, and you've got 30 FPS, then there is going to be 10 by 30 frames per second, 300 cached frequency graphs. The thing is, though, if you change the frames per second to 25, that's not going to fit anymore. So that is one case where basically all the frequency distributions have to be recomputed. Is when you've got something loaded in and then you change the frames per second of the scene. So one thing I will add is basically behind every pop-up where you can select an audio file, there's going to be a settings button where you can open a new window that allows you to recompute the frequencies for the current file or for all the files, replace it with another file, show some information about it, yada, yada, yada. So basically try to keep the node and everything as simple as possible, but give each one of them access to basically management functionality for the audio files that you're working with. But yeah, that is essentially the current state. One thing I have looked at a bit is the I think it's called audio modifier or something or audio effector, sound effector in Cinema 4D, which seems to be the most elaborate tool of that kind. And that's where I also got the idea of selecting ranges from. So that's basically the ballpark where this is supposed to head, except that as a node in Lightwave, it's going to be, I think, more versatile, because you can also use it for shading, which I don't think works in Cinema. I'm not sure about other 3D applications, actually, if they have something like that built in, or if that exists as a plugin. But I do have to thank each and every one of you that I wasn't that careful. I just didn't research all the other ones. I have to thank all of those of you that voted for this, because this is something that was on my mind for ages, and it does give me a chance to actually, code with audio, which is quite different but fun. And I've always liked the idea of being able to drive animations from audio files, and you basically use something like Lightwave as a really fancy audio visualizer. So I can't wait what's going to happen when you get your hands on this and have the time to play with it. Speaking of which, so now that I have the basics going, I can actually start writing something that is useful. And I suspect that by the end of the month, there will at least be a simple node that might not have all the bells and whistles. Maybe you won't be able to, have multiple windows open that show you the spectrum and the audio of everything. But it should at least, give you a chance to play with this and do something with it. And then we will have the month afterwards to just, really polish it to get it into a state where it's super useful. So yeah, that's all I can really, talk about right now. But I'm super happy that, it's in this state, because everything from now on is just, designing the plugins around it. But I know that the basics are working. And yeah, that was the hardest part, because the other parts, like writing plugins for Lightwave, I think I've done that before. Well, to be fair, John, I thought I would be further by now, but there were two or three stumbling blocks, like how to. I mean, basically, what happens is you take the waveform of an audio file and you run that through what's called a fast Fourier transform, which attempts to break it down into individual frequencies. And what you see here is, I'm not sure if you can read the labels. I'm using a graphics library that draws the text here. This is not Lightwave. Now what you can see here in the graph is that we've got 32 hertz on this side. We've got 22 kilohertz on that side, which for a 44.1 hertz audio file or samples per second audio file is the maximum frequency you can actually have in there, the so-called Nyquist limit, as many of you probably know. And if you go to the middle of the graph, let's say around here, this is actually 2 kilohertz. So this is actually not the middle of that frequency spectrum. What I did is, and that's where the graphic comes from that I posted on Patreon, that list of numbers. I think 2 days ago, I read something about, binning the linear frequencies from 0 to 22 kilohertz in this case into octaves. So that's what I did here. So basically, I think in this case, let me just check my code. What does it say here? There's a parameter. Yeah, 14. Okay. So one thing I learned is that in terms of frequencies, 1 octave is twice the frequency of the previous one, which means that if we go up in octaves, then we have more and more frequencies bunched together into 1 octave. Also, what you see here, you see the individual bars. Let me just increase those. And basically the distance from one bar to the next bar is 1/14 of an octave, which is half musical note, just about. And yeah, since I'm not much of a musician and don't ask me about music theory, that's just what I remembered. And the interesting thing is that this is a lot closer to how we apparently hear audio, which is you get a lot more resolution in the bass areas and in the mids. And then once it gets to 4, 5, 6 kilohertz, it quickly turns to 22 kilohertz. And if you look at the frequency distribution on an audio file like this one, that's also you see there's not much going on in the highs, but lots in the mids and lots in the lows. Should be 1/12? Okay. If you say so. Oh, there's 2 half notes in there, isn't there? Yeah, me and music. I like to listen to it, but yeah, don't ask me about the theory. Okay, change to 1/12. That was just like one number to swap out. Okay, so basically the distribution of the frequencies here is a lot more to how we tend to hear them, as opposed to just being linear. And I could turn that into an option, but I don't really think it makes sense. Yeah, exactly. Everything, 14 kilohertz is about here. So everything from here to the right, that's what old geezers like us don't hear. That's not important. So I suppose the only option that you're going to see in there is maybe an option to clip the decibel range in the vertical, which is right now from 0 to -96, I think, which is about the resolution that you get with 16-bit audio. I could clip that to 60, but I'd rather make that optional. And it's just for, visualizing this part of the user interface. And yeah, there's nothing more planned for the user for changing this at all, except for maybe changing the colors for the different volumes. It's basically limited to what is useful, and don't add too much except if people request it. Try to keep it as simple as possible, basically, and as useful as possible. And I think that's a good balance. But yeah, the nice thing is that, anytime you want to, you can just scrub through and you actually exactly see how the audio looks like at the current frame, which frequencies it's using. So if, for example, you are trying to find out which frequency range to use for a specific node, then you can scrub through your audio and say, okay, I actually want the bass and I just want this part here. And you look at where it's the most pronounced, and that's where it gives you the values. You select it there, and then you have it. So yeah, that's really all I can show or talk about today. There isn't much else. What I can do, however, not sure if I played this one already. Get another one of Steve's tracks and play it. Actually got some audio tracks that you get from YouTube for YouTube videos, but I thought it's much, much better if one of our patrons is kind enough to give us something to play with. Let me just turn down the volume a bit. Sticky peak. The problem with a sticky peak is that you need it to decay. And currently, the only time this is actually being rendered is when you scrub to a different frame. So if you stop it there, then the sticky peaks would just be at the same position. But yeah, I suppose I could add those. Yeah, yeah. I'll add that. And they look cool. Hey. Yeah, so the next step is to write a standalone audio player independent of Lightwave. One that allows you to mix multiple tracks, and then we can just have a party here. You probably could, yes, exactly. I mean, it wouldn't be super accurate because there's a limited resolution in getting the frequencies out, but you could theoretically at least drive individual keys on a piano from an audio track, even though you'd probably want to do that using MIDI files. I suppose Steve has a point. Just being able to analyze the audio that you've loaded into Lightwave itself is quite a benefit. So all right, that's what you're going to get this month, and next month you get the Node. Is that what you wanted? I mean, as I showed earlier with the test tones that I had, let's take 440 hertz, which is like a standard test tone. Load that in. You will notice that it bleeds, and that's just how the fast Fourier transform works. I could increase the resolution of it, and I will actually make that an option within a certain range per audio file, because I can my code is flexible enough to handle that. But you won't be able to get rid of that bleed on the side. So this is, I think, the A node, And that already covers like 3 bars here, so it's not super precise, which is probably not enough for a piano. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can imagine how I would use it, so that gives me an idea what the visualization should be like. Um, and yeah, I think just the fact that you want to be able to look at the frequency spectrum and be able to select something there, as opposed to having a user interface that just asks you, okay, how many kilohertz do you want? And you're like, I don't know. Can you show it? I think that alone is worth a lot. Because let's be fair, I mean, except for the 3D artists that play an instrument or um, have a knack for audio, most probably don't even know which frequency ranges something is in, except that there's low and high frequencies. So yeah, that's the state of the audio spectrum analyzer. Yeah, sure. Emitters could be affected by this. Um, Something like particle emitters, yes. There is going to be, I mean, you can use nodes just about everywhere in Lightwave. Where you can't use them is in envelopes. That's where you have channel modifiers. And there is going to be a channel modifier as well, which you can apply to like um, an emitter, an envelope that is on an emitter. And then you can just say, okay, I want, when this frequency is at a certain value, I would like to map that to output, I don't know, 10 to my channel. So there's going to be a scale for that as well. It's going to be fairly similar to the oscillator channel modifier. The oscillator that was, I think, last month or the months before, our plugin of the month. Um, that also exists as a node as well as a channel modifier. And the same principle is going to be applied here as well. Which yeah, gives you envelopes. You have the motions via the nodal interface. You have displacements via nodal displacements. You have shading via nodal. You can affect instances again via nodes. Probably a lot more. I don't know, light colors, but that again would be channel modifiers. So yeah, light colors could actually be a bit tricky because you have to apply the same channel modifier 3 times, but still should be doable. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And yeah, since there will be time inputs in the nodal version, you can also shift the time that's being evaluated. To be fair, just finding out how to deal with the output of the FFT was the hardest bit because there's some magic numbers in there that I'm still not sure should be there or not. Just to get from the amplitude that I get from the fast Fourier transformation to the decibels. And given the fact that some of my code of rearranging the samples was wrong as well, I always got results that looked very, very wrong. Where something was happening and it was kind of happening in the right places, but then again, it wasn't. And that just changed today. Well, yeah, that's why we started with the show. Thank you, Marie. And yeah, thanks to Steve for providing the music for it. So yeah, I think on. Yeah, me too. Me too. This is one of those things where I have to be careful not to spend too much time with it as well, because as much as I like music, even though I know nothing about the theories behind it or can't even play an instrument except for drums, um, it's certainly something that I will try to play with, and it's good to have at least some audio files that I can use. Well, Steve, if you want to, and I don't want to put any pressure on you whatsoever, um, if you want to make one of the audio files eventually available as for a sample scene or so, I think many of your fellow patrons would thank you for that, because that would at least allow us to at least create one sample scene that everybody can dissect, or maybe a couple of sample scenes. But yeah, I think this is going to be a really, really good time waster for many Lightwave users. Great, thanks, John. I can't wait to see how it goes either. And yeah, I was, as I said, I was just super stoked just to get this working a bit earlier today, and finally found out that once everything started to fit into place, it actually worked the way it's supposed to. Yeah, yeah. Ooh. Now that would be super cute, Steve. So yeah, um, I suppose that's it for today. Um, Thanks for all of you that took the time to join us. It's been a blast. Um, we are going to have the Q&A later this month, and hopefully, basically, if you get some code, something to play with before the Q&A, it's going to be a Q&A. If you don't, then I would actually rather make an open development stream like this one again, and just explain what's happening behind the scenes. Yeah, yeah, make it German. Steve just wrote that he would do something in Kraftwerk style. Yep. So yeah, again, thanks to all of you for joining us. And I suppose we all have a lot of time for live streams and stuff like this, but still, uh, stay safe out there. As they say, wash your hands and follow the usual routines. And if you haven't yet, actually, click the subscribe button on our channel. So, on that note, thanks for tuning in. Good night and bye bye.